My After 11 guest tonight is someone whose life was changed forever after one of the biggest scandals in the history of the NHS. Her name is Sue Threakall, and her husband Bob contracted HIV from contaminated blood. He died in 1991, aged just 47. Now, since then, 3 decades now, Sue has been fighting to get answers about how and why this could have happened, and she joins me on the programme right now. Sue, thank you very much indeed for finding the time to talk to me tonight.
That's no problem. Thanks very much for having me on.
So you now live in Devon, but
I do.
You're from Erdington originally, here in the West Midlands, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. I lived in Erdington all my life until about, I think it was 2001 when I moved down here.
So take us back to when you first met Bob. How did you meet, and tell me about the man himself.
Yeah, we actually met at work. When I finished teacher training college, I got a temporary job at a local branch of the civil service, basically, which is ironic. And Bob was already working there. My sister worked there as well, and Bob's best friend became my new brother-in-law. It was really weird the way it worked out. So I was kind of chief bridesmaid and Bob was best man, and we just got together like that. But, I mean, when I met him, I didn't understand anything about haemophilia at all. I knew that he walked a bit stiffly, and that was about it. There was kind of rumours that he got something wrong with him, but no one really clarified what. As I got to know him further, he told me about haemophilia and how it affected him, and I also became aware that he'd been married previously and had 2 boys from his first marriage. He was already divorced when I met him.
So apart from the haemophilia, what sort of man was he? Tell me about the man himself.
He was really funny. He told the most appalling jokes. He was fun. He was a real family man. He absolutely adored his family and his home. And when we got together and finally got married and bought a house in Erdington, a proper big Victorian family home, and he couldn't have been happier. His 2 boys moved in with us. 2 years later, we had our own son. We got cats and rabbits and, all the usual stuff that goes with children. At one point, his mum moved in as well. She was always around there. She looked after the children when I was working. His sister was always round, loads of friends. We both got really good careers. I was a deputy head in the local primary school. I actually got the deputy headship after we married. I'd been teaching for a few years at that stage. And we were living perfectly normal lives as far as I'm concerned. It was, I wouldn't say idyllic. I mean, I don't think anybody's is, but it was fine.
A good family life.
Yeah. That's
what I'm hearing. So Bob was a haemophiliac. Would you explain what that is and how it affected Bob? Yeah,
essentially, haemophiliacs are lacking a protein in their blood, and this particular protein enables their blood to clot. Now, a lot of people are under the misapprehension that if a haemophiliac cuts themselves, they'll bleed to death, and it isn't that at all. It's simply that if there is any damage to a haemophiliac, they won't bleed any more than you would or I would. They will simply bleed for longer.
Right.
So the main issue isn't with a small cut or a scratch. You can just apply normal first aid measures for that. It's when they get a knock or a bang and they get internal bleeding. Sometimes they get an internal bleed that is completely spontaneous. They haven't actually done anything to cause it. And of course, if you're bleeding inside, particularly if it's an arm or a leg, that blood has got to go somewhere. And what it does is sort of pressurises down and usually ends up on a knee joint, an elbow joint, an ankle joint. Most haemophiliacs have got what they call a target joint, which tends to flare up and bleed very easily.
So would he have to be really careful in the way he conducted himself?
I suppose in an ideal world, yes. I mean, haemophiliacs' mothers had the worst job and do have the worst job because they are obviously frightened to death from, especially when their children are very tiny.
So was Bob actually born with it?
Yeah, yes, it's an hereditary disease, yeah. It's actually carried by the female, so if Bob had daughters, 50% of her boys would have had haemophilia. So for example, if we hadn't had a son, we'd have had a daughter. who then went on to give us grandchildren, 50% of her boys would have been born with haemophilia.
All right, okay, I get that, yeah. So any mom, as you say, would be watching what they're doing, wouldn't they?
Yeah, especially, new moms and new to haemophilia, because very occasionally it arises spontaneously within a family. And, you hear so many stories, even today, of parents who are under suspicion of abusing their children because they take them to hospital covered in bruises time and time again. And it sometimes, if it's arisen spontaneously in a family, it sometimes takes time for the doctors to realise what it is. Most haemophilia families, however, understand it. There are some quite big haemophilia families with a lot of links between the different groups, and they kind of expect it, and more or less know how to handle it. But it can be very frightening, very worrying. But most haemophilia mothers I know are very obviously protective of their children and are concerned about them engaging in, say, contact sports and stuff. Most haemophiliacs I know couldn't care less and just go all out there to be as normal as possible. They don't want to be different.
Now, Sue, I know that shortly before you met, Bob was transferred to something called Factor 8. So what is Factor 8?
Well, if I take you back a bit first, when Bob was born, there was essentially no treatment if he had a bleed. And haemophiliacs can be in the most appalling pain from an untreated bleed, or even a treated bleed, to be fair. His mum would sit up late at night with him. I mean, Bob was the civil service chess champion locally, and that was simply because night after night after night, as a little boy, his mum had played games with him, including chess. He was good at it from a young age. In 1964, a treatment called cryoprecipitate was invented, and that was essentially fresh frozen plasma which was infused into them over a number of hours. It had to be done in hospital. It was time-consuming, it was awkward, but it worked, and it was relatively risk-free. However, in the 1970s, we started to import a product that was hailed as the kind of life-saviour for haemophiliacs. And depending on which clotting factors they were missing, it was called Factor 8 or Factor 9. Now, what they were not told at the time was that this commercial product was made as a result of literally tens of thousands of donations of plasma which were pulled together, literally chucked together in a big vat. I mean, it looks disgusting, if you see it. And if only one donation out of those tens of thousands was infected with, say, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, hepatitis A, HIV, anything, that would infect the whole pool. Nice. We found out far too late.
So when did you first realise something was wrong? What happened to Bob that made you start to worry?
We saw a World in Action television programme, or in fact we were alerted to it by a friend, and it was essentially warning about it, and the realisation dawned on us that most of the product that Bob was using came from America, and most of it was harvested from prison donations or from Skid Row donors, prostitutes, drug addicts and so on, who, by very merit of the sort of life they lived, tended to have a higher risk of an infection such as HIV and hepatitis.
Sure.
And so it was a highly infectious product.
Bob would develop hepatitis B, then C, and in 1985, doctors told you that he also had contracted HIV. I can't begin to imagine what this time was like for the both of you. Well,
he contracted hepatitis B before we got married, and I remember he was very reluctant to treat. They wanted him to treat at home. He didn't like doing it. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to use it at all. I couldn't understand why, and he actually said, well, you don't know what's in it. After we got married, things were fine for a couple of years. We had our son 2 years after we got married, and then he was told, as you say, in the summer of 1985, that an HIV test, some months before, I have to say, had proved positive, as it did with about a quarter of all haemophiliacs, and that he got HIV. And the only advice we were given was to use a condom, tell Sue not to get pregnant for a couple of years, and basically we'll see what happens.
Now, it's really important to emphasise at this point, this was in the mid-80s, the height of the AIDS epidemic. And it's not like today where people with HIV can live normal lives. This was effectively a death sentence back then, wasn't it?
Well, it was a death sentence, and not only that, we had all the stigma that went along with it. Every time we switched on the television, we were hearing about the gay plague. We were seeing images of crashing tombstones. We were seeing the slogan, "Don't die of ignorance." And very quickly, the haemophilia population in the UK became stigmatised and pilloried. We had instances of people who had their houses burnt down. People had paint thrown at their houses. People had slogans written on the walls. We had children that were effectively turned away from school because parents held meetings and said that they refused to send their children to school because there was a haemophiliac there. It didn't matter whether that haemophiliac child had actually got anything wrong with it.
Horrendous.
Simply the fact that you put your hand up and said you've got haemophilia was enough to make people start jumping up and down in fright.
Absolutely horrendous. I have to say, Sue, it's amazing that you didn't actually contract it yourself.
Well, it's particularly amazing when you think that, like many other haemophilia wives, we weren't actually told of the test result as soon as the doctors knew it. And there was a long delay, and this was at a time when we were actually trying for another baby as well. I was lucky, I was fortunate, I didn't contract it, but quite a lot, I'm not quite sure of the exact amount, but we're talking well into double, if not triple figures, of haemophilia sexual partners did contract it, and some of those have died. I mean, we've got more than one case of a child being orphaned, having lost both parents because of this.
Tell me about Bob's decline and the impact it had on you personally.
Well, in the early days, it was a matter of trying to find out everything we possibly could because the doctors weren't telling us an awful lot. They certainly weren't telling us everything they knew. And I don't think we fully understood what we know now, and they knew then, that they knew it wasn't safe. But having said that, yeah, we did a lot of research, and we also cooperated with the Haemophilia Society's request for people to go public, and we did quite a bit of television and radio work and so on. And in the early days, Bob was relatively well. They then tried him on a preventative drug for a particular pneumonia that people who are immunosuppressed get, and he reacted violently against the drug, so they couldn't try that one again. They then put him onto AZT when that came on the market as an antiretroviral. Now, in those days, AZT was prescribed in huge doses. I think he was on 1,200 milligrams in 2 measured doses each day, which is, by today's standards, enough to kill a horse. And I'm absolutely certain that it's seriously damaged, if not killed, a large number of haemophiliacs in those days. His health deteriorated quite rapidly. He was very frightened. Mentally he struggled. His personality changed, whereas before he was completely easygoing and a pleasure to be around. He became quiet and irritable and, all the things that go along with feeling ill and being frightened, basically.
I know you had to give up your job to take care of him in the end, and he finally passed away at the age of 47.
Yeah.
So at that point you had a child together and 2 stepsons. How on earth did you cope with something so devastating?
How did what, sorry?
How did you cope with something so devastating?
I didn't, in all honesty. I mean, my best friend would happily tell you that I was like a mad woman for about 10 years. I really didn't cope. Some people do, some people don't. Everyone's got their own ways of doing it. Life just basically fell apart. The family fell apart.
How and when did you actually find out that the blood product that Bob had been given was contaminated?
Well, that was probably right at the very beginning. We realised, having watched things on the television and having asked questions, about... So you worked it out for yourself? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, by the time he got the test results, it was perfectly clear what had happened, but not why it had happened or the fact it could have been prevented. I mean, that came later.
Was there any help or support at that time for you or families that...
No, not a bit.
Nothing?
We actually asked if there was any counselling, and we got sent down to the reference centre at Oxford for a couple of sessions, which was okay. We then fought as a group at the local hospital and finally got not a counsellor as such, but a haemophilia social worker. And that was about it, really, and there still isn't any. A few years ago, the government announced, very grandly in Parliament that they were allocating X number of pounds towards counselling for us. And after a few weeks, I thought, well, actually, that wouldn't be a bad idea for me and for my son, who's, struggled ever since. And I phoned up to ask for it, and it wasn't very long after they'd announced it, and they said, sorry, we haven't got any money left. And that was it. I don't know anybody that's had counselling that I haven't had to pay for privately.
Well, you now work with the campaign group Tainted Blood.
Yeah,
and I know that you've spent several years with meeting other victims of the scandal, and lots of funerals too. Oh,
loads of funerals. I mean, our ex-chair, Gareth Lewis, whose funeral we all attended, a few years ago, he once said that he'd counted up to 80 funerals that he'd been to. And I don't know how many I've been to, funerals, memorial services, one runs into another after a bit, which sounds awful. That sounds really crass, but it's not meant to.
Well, no, but I mean, it just explains the plight of all this, doesn't it?
Mm.
I know an inquiry has been finally announced. How long is it going to take? Do you know?
Oh, how long's a piece of string? I don't know. It was announced on the 11th of July 2017 by the Prime Minister. It was quite clear from the very beginning that they were putting the Department of Health in charge of it, and we all kicked up a fuss about that and said that we wouldn't cooperate with it because you couldn't possibly have the Department of Health, who were actually at the heart of this scandal anyway, being kind of judge, jury and executioner. So that took absolutely ages to sort out, and they finally put the Cabinet Office in charge of it. By November of 2017, they announced it would be a full statutory inquiry, which is what we've been campaigning for, so that they have the power to compel witnesses to give evidence under oath. They've got the power to ask for documentation to be given to them, and if people refuse to cooperate, they can be held in contempt of court. So, yeah, we got this statutory inquiry. That was November 2017, and it still hasn't started, basically. The chair was appointed in February this year. He started work full-time on the inquiry in May, but he can't actually do anything at the moment, and the inquiry can't formally start until the terms of reference are sent to the devolved administrations, i.e. Scotland and Wales, and then back to the Cabinet Office, where they're ratified and then handed down in Parliament.
Well, in the meantime, what help and support is there for families like yourselves?
It varies depending on what's wrong with you.
And also a postcode, I believe.
Oh, postcode, absolutely, yeah. Because Scotland and Wales are devolved, they are able to choose, and health is a devolved issue in those administrations, they are able to choose what they do. So both Scotland and Wales introduced over the last couple of years much better support schemes than that in England. And in fact, in my personal situation, and I'm not making any judgment on the amount of money, but what I am making a judgment on is the fairness of this. If I were in Scotland and Bob had been infected in Scotland, I would be receiving a pension-type payment of $27,750 per annum. I received nothing in England. If Bob had been infected in Wales and lived in Wales, I would have received a flat rate payment of, I think, about $90,000. English widows had a flat rate payment of $10,000, and that was it. And we have it on record that from pre-2016, there were murmurings in the Department of Health to reduce any support to widows, to taper it off, and then exit them from the scheme. The men who are really poorly at the moment, and those who are worst infected, stand to lose concessionary payments. There's no guarantees that those will carry on, and we're talking up to £4,000 a year.
So, 30 years on, what has this done to you and your family, your children especially?
I don't see my two stepsons, and quite frankly, I don't blame them at all. I mean, who'd want to be around this over and over and over again? Our son has been really damaged by it. to an extent that I really don't want to go into on air. But, his life is sad and lonely compared to what it should have been. They're all highly intelligent, articulate people who should, if they'd gone on the trajectory they all started off, they should have been real high flyers. And it didn't happen. I'm very close to our youngest one, and he lives, fairly near to me now, just a few miles away. But it's, the sort of essence of family life has gone. We had the perfect house, a lovely family, loads of friends, everything going for us. And then all of a sudden, that collapses round you like a landslide, and you think, where do I go from here?
You've been waiting a long time. I hope eventually, Sue, you get what you are looking for out of all of this. Thank you very much indeed for joining me on the programme tonight.
That's all right. Thank you very much for having me on.